إذن نحن بانتظار الإشارة من الفريق التقني. نعم. متحدثون الكرام.
Our dear panelists, to the audience via the different platforms, welcome once again back to this academic conference on the conflict in Yemen, on the past and potential outcomes in the future. OCHA estimates that more than 100,000 people have been killed due to direct confrontations, with 80% of the Yemeni people today needing direct support, including 4 million IDPs. In addition to that, there is the worsening humanitarian situation with the COVID-19 pandemic and the continuing economic shocks in Yemen. There are large logistical and bureaucratic hurdles in the way of humanitarian assistance and humanitarian efforts, and the country continues to face a lack of funding, with less than 25% of the humanitarian response plan being funded. Based on this, we see that the conflict, the map of the conflict has changed. There are regional developments, local developments. And with that, it was very important for there to be continued studies and discussions to try to come up with an effective plan for peace building in Yemen, something that would not be possible without having a clear and precise mapping of this conflict with the ongoing developments and changes, as well as its history throughout the past. The topic of our discussion during this session will be mapping the conflicts and trying to understand the dynamics. We have 4 speakers, researchers, and experts on Yemen. We have Peter Salisbury, Maysaa, Shuja, Al-Deen, Andrea Carboni, and Ibrahim Jalal. I will obviously introduce them now. And if you'll allow me to remind you with regards to any questions you might have, we will have time for questions and answers for 20 minutes. We will receive the questions via the Q&A function, and after each one of the speakers speaks for 12 to 15 minutes, we will open the floor for discussions, and I will notify you 2 minutes before the end of your time to wrap up. As for those following us on social media, we would like to welcome your questions and your comments on the respective platforms that you use. If we could now move directly towards the presentations of our panelists. Our first panelist is Mr. Peter Salisbury, who will present on conflict trendiness and future trajectories. Peter will present the 4 key trends that have emerged in the conflict and how they have affected policy and decision-making, as well as the peace process in Yemen. Peter is the International Crisis Group Senior Analyst in Yemen, and he has worked over the past 15 years as a journalist, researcher, and analyst with a focus on political and economic issues in the Middle East and North Africa. He has been consultant to the UK government, to the United Nations, and the World Bank. He has a master's degree from the London School. Peter, please go ahead. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mona, and good morning to everybody. Excellent to be on a panel with such an esteemed group of co-panelists, and I really look forward to the rest of the event. I'm going to try and be as quick as possible. This isn't an academic paper. I've not had a ton of time of late, so very kindly the organizers have allowed me to skip writing an academic paper and just talk through some of the broad trend lines that we at the International Crisis Group have been tracking and tracing, and I look forward to hearing responses from my panelists, who I'm sure can bring more nuance and maybe dispute some of what I'm about to say. But in effect, by the end of 2021, we saw 4 key trend lines, which we thought would be fundamental to our understanding of the future trajectory of the conflict. And these were the rise of the Houthis as a more powerful military and governance actor, something that could become particularly pronounced from 2019 to 2021. So in the wake of the Stockholm Agreement, which prevented a battle for the Red Sea port of Hodeidah, but was a period of vulnerability for the Houthis, who had killed Ali Abdullah Saleh at the end of 2017 who were trying to rebuild internal coalitions and then were threatened militarily. From 2019 onwards, after that deal was agreed and not implemented, what we saw was an opportunity for the Houthis to regroup as a governance actor and militarily and put provisions in place that allowed them to become more sustainable economically, some quite visible, some less visible. The second, and of course, the way that we sort of saw that most manifested was from January 2020 onwards, where the Houthis began to expand militarily, first into Al-Jawf, then into Marib, parts of Al-Bayda, really culminating last September and October in a period where the Houthis consolidated their control over Al-Bayda governorate, pushed into the south of Marib governorate, and even took some districts in Shabwa governorate. And at that point, they seem to be kind of at the peak of their powers, but as we'll see, that's not how things have necessarily played out entirely. The second trend line, which really also came to a head in that period, was loss of faith in the internationally recognized government of Yemen. And what we saw from 2019 onwards was a loss of territory on the ground, internal skirmishes between the government and its internal rivals, particularly the Southern Transitional Council, resulting in the STC takeover of Aden in August of 2019. And then from early 2020 onwards, two key patterns. One, loss of territory to the Houthis, and two, declining living standards in government-controlled territories, primarily via a decline in the value of the rial, the depreciation of the Yemeni rial in government-controlled areas, precipitated by a Houthi ban on new banknotes printed by the government since around 2017, 2018, which had more or less doubled money supply. And that ban basically sort of pushed all these new notes into less populous areas of the country, the Houthis controlling sort of somewhere between 60 to 70% of Yemen's population, pushed the entire pre-war money supply into these areas. So the government by September, October of last year, struggling to contend with this worsening currency crisis, which continued into December of 2017 and resulted in a doubling in the cost of living for people in many government-controlled or nominally government-controlled areas, and at one and the same time, the loss of territory on the ground, leading to rumors that the government would be somehow replaced or reconstituted, reshuffled with some kind of governing council to oversee day-to-day management of the affairs of the state, such as it was. The third trend, which I kind of alluded to here, was the rise of UAE-backed or UAE-aligned groups in Yemen, most prominently with the STC takeover of Aden in August of 2019, but subsequently with measures the STC took to increase their military control, their control over institutions and local governance, while negotiating with the government over the Riyadh Agreement signed at the end of 2019, which was meant to de-escalate tensions between the two and bring the STC in effect as a junior governing partner within the Hadi government. The STC playing this very delicate balancing act thereafter of both claiming that it's trying to implement the Riyadh Agreement and the government is not, while attempting to increase its control and its power on the ground in any way it could. But sort of aligned to that and parallel to that, what we'd seen was that the UAE continued to invest in terms of material and training in key forces, particularly along the Red Sea coast, the Guards of the Republic led by Tariq Saleh, and the Giants Brigades, which is kind of one of these groups that we hear a lot of noise about, certainly is led by Salafi leaders. The actual membership and composition of the Giants Brigades a little bit more complicated than just kind of Salafi forces. But these forces kept basically sort of contained along the Red Sea coast. So at the end of last year, what we'd also seen were international shifts that lent themselves towards this general broad trajectory, which is decline of government, increase in prominence and power of Houthis, and kind of gradual rise of UAE-aligned groups. What were the international shifts? We saw a presidential election in the United States that brought in a new administration, which was much more hostile to Saudi Arabia, and hoped to push the Saudis to simply, quote unquote, end the war, although what that looked like was always a little bit vague. We had seen divergences and rifts between the UAE and the Saudis, both within Yemen, over strategy on the ground, over which groups each side backed. The UAE, sort of very anti-Muslim Brotherhood, and saw Islah and networks affiliated with Islah within Yemen as being sort of, in effect, no different from the Muslim Brotherhood, and sought, as much as it sought to defeat the Houthis, sought to uproot Islah from areas where its allies existed, leading to tensions with the Saudis, whose main partners on the ground, while not sort of always technically Islah, connected to these broader kind of political, military, tribal networks that you see around Islah. And we also saw efforts on the Saudi part to de-escalate tensions with Iran, with a particular focus on Yemen. What we've seen since the beginning of 2022 really arguably emerges from this moment of crisis for the Saudis and for anti-Houthi forces on the ground from September, October 2021 onwards. The Saudis were relatively clear in saying that they could use airstrikes to slow Houthi advances into Marib, and certainly the forces on the ground put up an incredible fight against the Houthis. But the fact was that sort of all other key front lines remained largely dormant, and the Houthis were able to focus and advance on Marib slowly but surely, and were obviously willing to pay a very high attritional cost for the ultimate prize of Marib, symbolically pushing the government out of its last real urban stronghold in the north of the country, if you want to call that, and taking Marib's oil and gas resources, and even in the Houthi view, beginning to re-export that oil via Hodeidah. What we saw from the Saudi side was the potential for a collapse in the government that had been supporting since 2015. The Houthis sitting with even greater control of space along its southern border, and certainly from the conversation that was emerging in Washington, D.C., greater pressure from the US to simply end the war by cutting some kind of deal with the Houthis. And what we saw was, in effect, I would argue, some kind of understanding between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and the UAE on the other hand about how to prevent total humiliation in Yemen and turn the course of the war so that pressure politically and militarily was restored against the Houthis rather than against the coalition. But that was going to come at a cost. That meant that the UAE was in effect allowed to nominate a governor for Shabwa governorate, and it was able to bring forces the government had refused to allow to come into Shabwa in both the Giants brigades, these sort of Salafi-led, if not purely Salafi forces, but also newly created or sort of reconstituted forces, the Shabwa protection forces, which appear to be sort of a reshuffled form of the Shabwa elite forces the UAE had overseen the creation of, but were pushed out of Shabwa in 2019 during that fighting in Aden. So the UAE and its allies, suddenly a very important actor in Shabwa again, and able via Amalika, via these Giants brigades, and via its air power and coordination with these forces on the ground to push the Houthis first out of Shabwa and then push into the strategically important territory in the south of Marib, particularly a district called Harib. Now, when we cut through everything that's happened what we see is less that the conflict has moved from being tilted towards the Houthis towards being tilted directly against the Houthis, and something closer, I would argue, to overall military equilibrium. So we've got to a place again, which is we've seen for long periods in this conflict, where it doesn't appear that either side is able to make major breakthroughs. And indeed, when they do, the other side reverses those gains very quickly, as we saw happening in Hajjah in the northwest of Yemen just last week. Others, I'm sure, will disagree. But the Houthis, having spent a lot of resource and manpower on trying to take Marib, still end up looking in a much more difficult position than they were previously, because to hold the front lines they currently have requires a relatively high rate of attrition. The Houthis also at the moment facing economic issues that haven't quite been there, that may burst some of this sort of claim they've made for strong economic governance. Too many banknotes in the government-controlled areas, not enough banknotes in Houthi-controlled areas, a real estate boom in Sana'a that appears to be cooling down. And the next trend line, though, this loss of faith in the government, that hasn't really changed. So whereas one could argue that Houthi losses in Shabwa and southern Marib would be a boost for President Hadi and for the government, the fact that the UAE had to exert influence, if not directly re-enter the conflict, given the strong statements the government have made against the UAE in previous years, isn't actually a selling point for the government. And of course, Yemen, there are always rumors, and I don't want to propagate any one rumor too many times, but certainly the story is that there is a bigger picture here, and that the UAE and the Saudis have bigger plans for their reconstitution of the anti-Houthi bloc with UAE-aligned forces, maybe parts of the GPC, the General People's Congress, being brought into much more prominent positions in the coming months, domestically and at the national level. So we see the government still really quite threatened, even though the loss of Marib appears to be not imminent, which could have precipitated a complete collapse in the government. Those UAE-aligned groups who had been kind of on this slow upwards trajectory, we see regionally within sort of the networks of the GPC, and we see within the military and strategic piece an increase in their prominence and relative influence on sort of the internal geostrategic space in Yemen. And we see shifts internationally because the Houthis have responded to UAE influence on the ground very clearly by firing missiles at the UAE and drones at the UAE, including very clear civilian targets. And that's really changed American thinking, which was already shifting on Yemen. The Americans had hoped they could come in something, I don't know who's still on the call, but a blaze of glory in the first months of the administration, pressure the Saudis to simply get this thing done and call Yemen a day. It turned out Yemen wasn't low-hanging fruit. The timing was not good. The Houthis were on the front foot. They saw no reason to compromise, and you do need compromise to stop the fighting. The US now considering a range of options, including a foreign terrorist organization designation for the Houthis, and the anti-Houthi external bloc, the Saudis, the Emiratis, more aligned than they've been than in the past, and really working on a campaign. Sure. 1 minute. Yep. And the Saudis and Emiratis pushing towards a campaign, if you like, of maximum pressure on the Houthis, politically, internationally, domestically, showing a united anti-Houthi front, showing a united anti-Houthi international community, and pressure on the ground economically through various different factors. So very, very quickly, if we take these sort of four trends as being pretty key to Yemen's future trajectories really are contingent on several points. First, the extent of Houthi resiliency, which people have very different opinions on. Some people seem to think they're always on the verge of collapse. I'm not one of those people. I think they are pretty resilient. And that's not to say that I think they are Superman. I don't think that they can last forever under economic and military pressure, but I do think that the population in their areas will be the first to suffer. The second question is the continued cohesion of the anti-Houthi bloc within Yemen and the broader regional coalition of forces, which has been really sort of the main stumbling block to kind of a unified response against the Houthis. The third is international responses, whether we will see international cohesion continue on Yemen. And that'll do.
I'm sorry, Peter,
That's
but
fine.
if we could just move on and give, we'll leave some of these important points to the question and answer session. Thank you very much. And I'm very, very sorry to interrupt you, but we will move on to the next speaker to keep up with our agenda. In your paper, you spoke about the effect that most recent developments have had on Yemen and the effect that this has had on this security and stability of the region. But one good point is that there seem to be opportunities that could be invested, which were mentioned indirectly, that could be invested in the peace process in the region. We will discuss these points in the question and answer or in a later session in the conference. Thank you very much for your presentation, Peter. And now we move on to Ms. Maysaa Shuja Al-Deen, who will present on the dilemma of federalism in Yemen. Her paper discusses an important point of the political conflicts in the country since 1994. Maysaa is a senior researcher at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. Her writing and analysis have been featured in numerous media outlets such as As-Safir Al-Arabi, Al-Arabi Al-Jadid, and Al-Monitor. Shuja Al-Din holds a master's degree in Islamic Studies from the American University in Cairo, and her thesis focused on the rise of Zaydi radicalism in Yemen. Go ahead, Ms. Maysaa. Ms. Maysaa, if you could please unmute yourself. Thank you, Muna. Thank you very much, Muna. I would like to thank all of the guests and the other panelists, and thank you for inviting me. I will now be discussing the issue of federalism. I believe this is a very important issue for two reasons. The first is relating to the nature of Yemen as a state, as a country. It is a country that has an area of around 500,000 kilometers squared. Its geography is very rough, deserts and mountainous areas, and most of the population is centered in the north. It is a country that has very high population growth. There's a population of 30 million or a bit less. These were from statistics before the war, but after 8 years of war, this would have changed. It was around 25 million in population before, and well, distributed over 100,000 residential areas. This is very dispersed. Most of these residential areas or agglomerations have less than 100 households. And this obviously imposes very large political challenges to any Yemeni state, especially if it is a centralized state. And that's the first reason. The second reason is the issue of federalism was a very core issue of the dialogue and discussion since 2011. It was presented before, but since 2011 it has become a pivotal and central issue in Yemeni politics. Federalism at the beginning of the establishment of the two modern states in 1962 in the north and 1967 in the south, the issue of federalism was not put on the table. There was a more nationalistic ideology with a central state, and this was seen as the natural state of things. This was up until 1989 when Yemeni unification was discussed. Yemeni unification is something that has been presented and discussed for a very long time, but in 1989 the situation in the region was suitable with the collapse of the Soviet Union and there being a political will, or at least a political necessity by the two parts of Yemen, the two states, to start working on the unification of Yemen. During this period, the issue of federalism was presented, first a confederal system between the two parts, but according to historical narratives by most sides, Ali Salim al-Bid, in a meeting with Ali Abdullah Saleh, he suggested unification and a central state, and this is what was done. Ali Abdullah Saleh was very was supportive of this idea. Yemeni unification was achieved in May of 1990. And then once again, the issue of federalism was presented as a solution to the problems faced by the modern state in Yemen. But when both sides signed the agreement of peace and of accord and consensus, which aimed to try to avoid the civil war that happened after the unification in 1990, they approved the idea of decentralization, of having decentralized authorities and local councils throughout the governorates of Yemen. But this was not implemented because the civil war started, and Ali Abdullah Saleh started to move away from the implementation of this. Up until 2000, with pressure from the opposition parties and many actors in the Yemeni political arena, the local councils law was issued in 2000, and the first local elections were held in Yemen in 2000. Legally, at least on paper, theoretically, these local councils and local authorities had authority and they had power, but practically everything remained in Sana'a, and the Yemeni state was extremely centralized. When I say it was extremely centralized, I mean even the most simplest things, primary school certificates or diplomas, the most simple of documents, people would have to travel from very distant governorates, sometimes taking a whole day to travel to the capital Sana'a, in a country where the transportation network was still very basic, and a country that is very widespread. So people had to go to Sana'a, travel to Sana'a, just to do these very simple processes. And sometimes even their salaries they would have to receive in Sana'a. And there was extreme centralization of authority at the time. Ali Abdullah Saleh got used to governing and ruling Yemen individually in centralism. And usually the idea of centralization is linked to this kind of this type of rule. In 2011, once again, the issue of federalism was brought up, and it had gained a lot of momentum. And very clearly, we can see that most of the political elites, from both the north, and when I speak of the elites in the north, I mean the Zaydi elites from north of Sana'a, who have dominated the political situation for more than 3 decades. These elites refused the idea in the beginning, including the leadership of the Islah Party, which was a broad coalition of tribal and Islamist members. And it was also rejected by the GPC, Ali Abdullah Saleh's party, and the Houthis. They all refused at the beginning, but the Islah reconsidered, and then the GPC also reconsidered, and the Houthis continued to try to maneuver around making any commitments. At the time, the core of the issue of federalism, which was discussed at the National Dialogue Conference, which started in March 2013. But from March 2013 until January 2014, the end of the NDC, this issue was not discussed clearly for many reasons, and it was avoided most of the time.
In the last session of the NDC, and in an undemocratic fashion, had approved the creation of a committee from inside the NDC, and the function, the mandate of this committee is to produce a plan for federalism in the country. So the shape of the state will be determined by this committee, which was established by Hadi in an undemocratic fashion. And this committee, in less than a month, they have produced a plan for federalism in the country, 6 regions, and until now, the criteria adopted by this committee are unclear. Are they development, political, economic, what sort of criteria? And the word of federalism, by the way, is English, and it was not clear for the Yemeni society, and therefore the Houthis at that time, through their media propaganda with part of the GPC and Saleh group, they spread the information, that this is a plan to divide Yemen, and this notion actually attracted a lot of Yemenis who link between the division of the country and federalism. This federal proposition was refused by the vast majority of the political parties, with the exception of Hadi and the Islah Party. GPC, Ali Abdullah Saleh, and the Houthis were jumping sides. They, first of all, they fully rejected the idea, and the Houthis, they tried to be aligned with the southern blocs, the Socialist Party and the Southern Movement or Hirak. These two later parties were calling for a federalism of two regions in the country on the borders of 1990, and the Houthis were flipping sides. They claim that they are with the southern Hirak, and sometimes they say that they're against federalism, and sometimes they say that federalism has isolated the Zaidi region and that the Azal region is created on sectarian lines, and this is true. This region was for the Zaidis, and the Houthis wanted an opening to the sea. So their demand was to have a seaport or an outlet to the sea. So their demands were changing, and the different propositions on the table were to have a federalism of two regions or a central state and or to change the Zaidi region and to have a coastline for that region. So after that, war broke out in the country, and one of the reasons for this war and for the political crisis was the abduction of Ahmed Awad bin Mubarak, who was the manager of the presidential office, because he was carrying the draft of the constitution, which was about federalism, and they have abducted bin Mubarak in January, and this led to the resignation of Hadi and the prime minister, and the escalation of the situation and the collapse of the peace and accord agreement or document, which was signed when the Houthis invaded Sana'a. And then things escalated until we saw war in March 2015. So from here, we can say that federalism was one of the dilemmas facing the Yemeni state and was one reason for the war, and not the main reason probably, but one of the key reasons for the war. And it is now that all Yemeni parties, they agree that federalism has to be applied. And here we have an issue. The first is that the Houthis were the reason for the collapse of the Kuwait talks. After the collapse of the Kuwait talks, they had their government with Ali Abdullah Saleh, and then CBY was divided. And since then, the Yemeni state is in a state of fragmentation. And the Houthis started practically to establish their own state in areas they controlled. And they control these areas through the state institutions, which are situated in Sana'a, while for the rest of the country, it does not have any state institutions from before the war. And the Houthis now, they are establishing their own state. They changed the school curricula, and now they have a vast network of a parallel state through which they govern. They have the network of the so-called the supervisors. And therefore, it is very difficult to talk about any settlement through which the Houthis will give up the state that they started to establish. So this is one point. So the issue here is that the model of the Houthis is heavily centralized. And this is related to the ideological nature of the Houthis and their autocratic nature as well. Their governing model and their ideology is religious, and it is theocratic. The other issue in the areas not controlled by the Houthis is that, generally speaking, in this stage, the borders that divide the different parts of Yemen are not final, because the war is not yet over, and arms are moving and are fueling the war. For example, a month ago, the STC was not in control of Shabwa, but it is now. And therefore, there are borders that are still shifting because the war is not over. But even within these borders, the issue is that areas that are not controlled by the Houthis are controlled by different actors, supported by different regional forces, and therefore they draw their borders away from the social situation or the development or the economy. The current delimitation of the borders in Yemen is about the sharing of some regional influence, and this sharing of influence has nothing to do with the criteria that should be adopted in order to divide the country into a federal state. You have 1 minute. And therefore, this will create huge issues concerning the nature of the regions that will be produced by this war. There is also the problem that we have a centralized government, and currently we have a centralized government. There is no alternative for the capital Sana'a. The capital Sana'a is being controlled by the Houthis, and because of the war legacy and the fragmentation in the country, any central state will be weak, and this central government must have the minimum level of presence, and this is not yet there. And even if the war ends, the Yemeni state will continue to be very fragile, and we will continue to be small, many states here and there, and it could be fueling more wars in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Maysaa, for this excellent presentation about federalism in Yemen. This is a renewing discussion for years, and the approach or the perspective of some and their arguments, actually, they think that this is a way for peace in Yemen. Others believe otherwise. Thank you for this intervention, and let me change the program of this session. I'll give the floor now to Mr. Ibrahim, and after that I'll come back to Mr. Andrea. This is because of the cross-cutting nature of the topics, as Ibrahim will be discussing an issue that is very close to Maysaa. Ibrahim Jalal will be talking about the NDC's institutional design and implications of it on the representation, negotiations, and outcomes. Ibrahim Jalal is a non-resident scholar in the Gulf and Yemen program at the Middle East Institute, and he is a research fellow at the Yemen Policy Center. He was engaged and he worked with different institutions. He has a master's degree in security, conflict, and strategic studies from Glasgow, from the University of Glasgow. Mr. Jalal, you have the mic. You have 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you everyone. حاول أتكلم بالإنجليزي للسهولة اليوم. Thank you for hosting me, and I appreciate actually speaking up to Maysaa particularly. So apologies, Andrea, for the mix-up. So I'll be talking about the National Dialogue Conference, which obviously was celebrated with cheered at times as Yemen's most inclusive platform. As part of the transition element of the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative that took place between 2011 and 2014, and the NDC has been an epic component of that political transition that eventually collapsed. And if we talk about the NDC in technical terms, putting aside the political trajectory and the security landscape of the country, we would literally not understand why it eventually collapsed. So as much as I go today into the institutional design of the NDC through using an illustrative example of the state building working group, and this is basically based on over a dozen of interviews and of course synthesis of available literature and the proposals that were put forward by the engaged parties. So in today's discussion, would like to look at the implications of the institutional design in three phases. First, on representation and representation and inclusion are big things when it comes to the peace process. The second, in terms of negotiation dynamics, and of course, how it enabled or sort of at times constrained the bottom-up forces of the civil society or young people, youth and women in particular, who came in the post-Arab Spring uprising. And third, in terms of the outcomes of all of these processes. So generally, the NDC started in March 2013 and then eventually finished in late January 2014. And it was supposed to happen way much earlier. And the delay basically stems from the political landscape that was stalled for some time then. And it was as big as we had about 565 delegates, theoretically drawn from across the social, political, and religious forces in the country. And they were distributed eventually into 9 working groups, some of which were key in deciding the way forward in Yemen. And one of these was the Southern question, the other was the Saada case, and then we had, I think, the most important committee, and that is the state building, which actually overlaps with some of these cases. And within this, then we had the technical preparation committee that has basically allocated 50% share of seats within the NDC for the Southerners, given that we noticed some sort of opposition by the Southern Iraq or Iraq al-Janubi to engage, and also the Southern elite, such as Ali Nasser and Ali Salim al-Bid and the other leadership of the Southern movements generally. And then we had the inclusion of certain actors that were not included in the GCC initiatives. And this, for example, deals with the civil society, who actually had at least 1/5 of representation, and then 20 to 30% per youth and women in each group that was engaged. And then we had also the Houthis as an armed movement or an armed group who actually were neither signatory to the GCC initiative nor a political party like the rest of actors who were not represented, yet were engaged. And at the same time, despite this inclusion, we also saw a marginalization of some regionalized levels of grievances. So if you look, for example, at Ma'ad, it was an oil and gas hub where electricity would come from. You'd see the cables flying all over Ma'ad, but then nothing is for the generation of power and the electricity. And that is just one form of grievances. And then you have grievances in Hadramaut and you have those in Tahama. So we saw some degree of cherry picking of grievances. And these were determined by a few factors. First, the threat perception to the whole idea of regime survival, of regime security. And this actually did not speak much to the genuine desire to resolve long accumulating grievances in the country. So yes, you had these important grievances that could expand in terms of geographical scope within the country. But again, they will not address all of these issues as you seek a new political map, socioeconomic one for the country. And then you have also political parties. So you had new political parties that were engaged, such as Justin and Building Party, which was basically established after the Arab Spring. And at the same time, there were an exclusion of other political parties, such as a Tadamun. And then if we look at the management of these groups at the leadership level of how they were micromanaged, you'd see also, some sort of political bargaining in terms of allocation. So you would see, for example, a porter coming from the civil society or youth and women groups. You would see a chair of a group coming from one political party and then the deputy from the other. So there were also these mechanisms by which they would ensure diversity, at least in representation, even at the most symbolic level. And within our case, so we saw, for example, so the delegates, we said, were distributed in 9 committees or 9 working groups, some as big as 81 participants, and some as not relatively so small to as had 40 members. And to me, regardless of the interviews that are conducted, I think the whole number is literally large. Although, data, at least, or the opinions of those interviewed suggest that the number is just fine and didn't, speak much to the quality of negotiations. And I think this can be also refuted as we go into the overlap between the working groups. And then as we go to the negotiations at the state building working group, so the whole idea of this committee was basically to envisage a new political path for the country, whether in terms of the shape of the state, the structure, the political and social foundations, the separations of power, the identity of the state, and of course, federalism, which Maysaa have helped me so much by talking about in terms of the different views that the political parties had and the political maneuvers or political ping pong between Saleh and the Houthis, or the socialists and the Southerners, etc., etc. So in the consensus building, we had an estimated 55 participants, and the whole agenda in the first 3 months between March and June, they figured out that there was an overlap in terms of discussions, that the whole pace of discussions was actually slowed down. So when they came to discuss the whole idea of federalism, you had the Southern members within the committee voicing out against further deliberations within the state building working group. And that actually raises one question. Should we have had at that point a central theme by which we determine the basic ideas to develop consensus and then depart to break down all the issues, or vice versa? And then at the Southern group, we had also a scenario by which they failed to actually reach consensus, or even in the event of failing to have consensus, to have 75 majority vote to actually go in direction either for or against the proposal. So within the committee, according to the negotiation guidelines, prepared by the Technical Preparation Committee of the NDC, if parties fail to develop consensus, which is basically the mainstream decision-making mechanism, then you
انقطع الصوت. أستاذ إبراهيم.
If we had basically, you would have to eventually 25% DHK. Then have to. أيوة. هل تسمعيني؟
نعم تفضل.
هل الصوت موجود؟
نعم تفضل، أمامك 5 دقائق.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
نسمعك أستاذ إبراهيم. Would you please unmute yourself? أستاذ إبراهيم.
Apologies. So we had 2 cases.
أستاذ إبراهيم.
هل تسمعيني؟
نعم أسمعك الآن، تفضل.
نعم ممتاز. Apologies, classic. We had to basically, if we pay of the state basically, and that was whether the Yemeni state, whether religion as in Islam should be the source or a source of legislation. And in that case, we had a clear division between the civil society forces, youth and women, conservative political parties, in which we had Islah and the Houthis basically opposing the view of the and of A, it should be basically B. And then we had a member, for example, of that particular committee defaming fellow colleagues or delegates of the committee to the extent of accusing them of going against the religion or describing them publicly as takfiris. And then the consensus committee would come to seek and develop consensus among the different parties. And then we had, for example, Professor Ahmed Al-Deen, who led the Houthi team within the delegation, eventually made a concession so as to push this forward to the consensus building. But then we had a scenario in which this whole, consensus building or 75% majority decision-making mechanism didn't work. And that was the case of federalism. And basically because of the overlap that we saw within the committee, at the Southern Working Group wanted to discuss the whole issue of secession or other forms of state independently from the whole working group of the state building. Then we saw the national, at the NDC outcomes document is that the whole federalism details would be eventually referred by the working group, by the Southern Working Group. And this overlap meant that we had, excessive, non-utilized working manpower, ideas, and of course, time and space. And because of, within the Southern Working Group where we spoke about federalism, and
أستاذ جلال أمامك دقيقتان.
Two federal regions as Maysaa or 3 regions, and then we had a developed that we had the group called 8+8, or the 60-member group that basically was focused on discussing federalism and resolutions to the Southern question. And because of that failure again, then the whole idea of federalism was just agreed was agreed upon as a principle, but not its details. So in terms of outcomes, yes, we had a broader agreement on the shape of state, but not how this shape of state should be looked upon from distribution of power and wealth. That, as Maysaa highlighted earlier, President Hadi eventually formed a committee after the NDC to discuss, the shape of federalism that should have been determined within the STC. So we've seen scenarios where non-elite, mainly bottom-up peace-building forces, youth and women, were able to counter and challenge the traditional centers of power, but there were also ways and mechanisms that enabled the ruling elite, including the president, to politically maneuver and delay the lengthy discussions on the shape of federalism, which was literally so important. And this takes us back to basically a couple of points as we reflect. Okay. And this takes us back basically to a few lessons learned from this whole process. One, the centrality of issues. Should we focus on strategic discussions and then eventually bring down the minor issues or, the things that require further deliberation? Whether we should include spoilers without commitment or actually seek, commitment before, especially as we saw two-way of negotiations within the NDC's Mozambique and negotiations militarily outside the capital, in which we saw the Houthis, for example, politically marching from Saada to Jawf, Amman into Sana'a eventually. And then representation, is just numbers or more actors that actually reflect the diversity of the country and the grievances. And finally, is the checks and balances and the necessity to avoid power and influence centralization within the hands of those attached to the president, which means we need more technocratic facilitators, secretariat within the NDC instead of basically gatekeepers that bypass the ideas pushed by the elite and the president. Would just put an end there. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا لك أستاذ جلال على الوقت تماما ومداخلة قيمة.
Thank you, Jalal, for this valuable intervention, and you pointed out to the point that the faults in the institutional setup and not addressing the issue of federalism within the NDC resulted in some adverse impacts on the process of the transition, and this undermined the peace and stability in the country. I go back now to Dr. Andrea Carboni, and he will present a paper titled Taming the Snakes, Cohesion, Fragmentation, and Violence in Wartime Yemen. Carboni will be analyzing the dynamics of the internal relations in areas controlled by Ansarullah and their allies. Andrea Carboni is a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Global Studies of the University of Sussex. and he has a PhD in geography from the same university, and he works as an analyst for humanitarian affairs in Mercy Cause, and his research interests include the politics and the institutions of the contemporary Yemen. He previously worked as a researcher for the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project and as a freelance consultant for several research institutions. Dr. Carboni, you have the floor. You have 15 minutes.
Dr. Carboni.
Yes, I'll share my screen if I...
نعم تفضل.
Okay.
Can you share it now?
Okay, it doesn't seem to work. So
you don't have the access.
Yeah, I can actually just go and present without the slides, which
okay,
is...
I'll ask my colleagues.
Okay.
To give you the antidote.
Well, I'll start so we won't waste time. Thanks, Mona, for the introduction. My presentation lies on a, I'd say, ideal continuum with the previous ones, and which focused, of course, on national and regional dynamics of the conflict and on the nature of the Yemeni state. I'm instead asking what turned the Houthis from an insurgent group with limited territorial outreach into a regime that now rules over many millions of Yemenis. Why are Houthi-controlled territories credited with greater stability as opposed to the fragmentation plaguing southern Yemen? And also, how could the Houthi movement evolve in the future? A possible answer to these questions can be found in examining the internal organization of armed groups, and particularly the organization of the Houthi movement. To answer these, I build on existing research that on insurgent groups in South and Southeast Asia in particular, to argue that the pre-war networks in which the leaders of the Houthi movement were embedded later determined the nature of the organization when the conflict started. And then during the conflict, we've seen outbreaks of violence at the local level in Houthi-controlled territories, which also resulted in major changes in the organization of the movement and in its relations with other groups across much of northern Yemen. So to start, I mean, I wanted to present in the slides kind of some tables, but it's okay. I mean, the first...
نعم يمكنك المشاركة الآن.
Oh, yeah.
You can share now your slides.
Doesn't seem to work, but okay. Oh, that's fine. So the first step is to kind of conceive our groups as networks in competition against each other rather than uniform institutional entities, which usually are formed by discrete sets of actors. And by doing these, we can analyze armed groups beyond the classical distinction between state and non-state actors, which is especially pertinent to Yemen, where these boundaries are often blurred and where a characteristic of many armed groups is that they have strong links with local constituencies. And so we have to ask ourselves how we can actually distinguish armed groups from one another. All groups have central processes of decision-making and local processes of recruitment and combat. And they differ particularly in the strength of these control processes at the local and national level. So we have, let's say, pre-war horizontal ties between the leaders and vertical ties between the leaders and the local constituencies. And these determine the strength of the central and local organizational control when the leaders of an armed group mobilize their base for a conflict, for instance. So organizations that have robust control processes typically coordinate strategies collectively. They can retain the unity of their leaders. They have ideological party lines to recruit new members. While at the local level, they can impose obedience on low-ranking commanders who are loyal to the leadership of the group. By contrast, organizations that have weak control processes are more vulnerable to leadership splits, infighting at the local level, to revolts, insubordination. And so the table shows basically the different types of organizations that we can identify based on these, combination of strong and weak processes of control at the central and the local level. So we have integrated organization, vanguard, parochial, fragmented. But what actually matters here is that they are all linked with different types of dissent, of conflict that can arise. Integrated organizations have minimal dissent, while others have, conflicts that occurs along specific dimensions, central, local, or between factional commanders, or pervasive across the organization. Next slide, please. So, of course, this is not static. These changes over time. The initial organization of a group basically can impose constraints in the likelihood, in the nature also of the change. And we see in many different conflicts shifts from one type of insurgent organization to another, as long as the social ties, the underlying social ties also change. And of course, we know that some groups are more vulnerable to specific types of change. For instance, in the case of integrated organizations, so those that are very strong both at the central and the local level, we see that effective counterinsurgency or mismanaged expansion into new areas may result in destabilizing the organization and in fragmenting. Other organizations which have different, strength at either the local or central level may increase that strength or may also suffer from further fragmentation. I highlighted some of them because they will come back to when we examine specifically the case of Yemen. In short, if we explain insurgent kind of organization, we can actually understand a bit better how and when a group can generate military and political power over conflict, or is also more prone to fragmentation and factionalism. So in the next slide, I'll start basically going a bit more into the evolution of the Houthi movement. So I identified three main periods. Of course, that's debatable, but I'll start suggesting that the Houthi movement before the war, so the pre-war networks, which I hinted at before, were developed between the 2000s or the 1990s and 2013. And during that time, the Houthi movement was what we can describe as an integrated organization. Strong horizontal networks between the leaders and strong vertical networks between the leadership and the local constituencies. And we have multiple examples of that. When it comes to, for instance, ties and the networks that exist between the leaders, we know, for instance, that still now, many of the most important political leaders or military commanders share kinship ties. They are part of the same family, either by the original Houthi family or by marriage. They enter the family. Many of these leaders have also shared the same experience during the Sada Wars. They fought along with each other against the government. At the same time, as I mentioned, they also have strong vertical ties, so strong links with local constituencies. Again, some examples here could include the emergence of the supervisory system, which I think Maysaa mentioned before, which emerged in 2011 in Sada and then was exported and is still kind of running until this very day. And then a number of local alliances that actually facilitated the expansion of the Houthi movement from Sada into other provinces across the country. And we can, of course, mention a few examples. I don't have time, but I think the case of Ibrahim is quite interesting of these expansion into non-Houthi strongholds. A major change occurred, of course, in 2014 when the alliance between the Houthi movement, which was also raised by Maysaa, by Ibrahim, between the Houthi movement and the faction of the General People's Congress loyal to Ali Abdullah Saleh started to emerge. So we had on one side the Houthi movement, which had, as an integrated organization, strong ties, and the GPC, which is typically described as a big tent party, supporters united by a kind of loose Republican ideology, drawn from several regions, several social groups. The same leadership was split in multiple groups and factions, and brought together a number of constituencies. So we can, using the typology developed before, it could be a parochial organization. The problem was that over time, and particularly during the war, Saleh's patronage network, which kept together the GPC, started to drain up because of multiple reasons. And so his grip on state institution was weakened and was left actually more vulnerable to Houthi expansion. They basically took advantage, the Houthis took advantage of the alliance with Saleh to access local tribal, military, political networks associated with his family and with the GPC. But the major problem arose, and that was basically the cooperation between the leadership of the Houthi movement and the GPC was limited to non-existent. We had the Houthis accusing Saleh of conspiring with the coalition, and Saleh accusing the Houthis of bullying, basically, of removing GPC loyalists from positions of power. And that's the moment exactly when you have internecine fighting starting, particularly in December 2017. The Houthis disposed of Ali Abdullah Saleh and turned what started as a formal, at least, power sharing agreement with the GPC into absolute control over state institutions. At the same time, so that was basically how they consolidated control at the central level. But at the local level, they also faced increased instability due to the fact that Saleh's mediating role, let's call it that way, came to an end. And many local leaders that were associated with the GPC rebelled against the Houthis. And to some extent, they exercised a weak grip on many parts of northern Yemen. And two major examples, again, cited before by my colleagues, are the Hajur rebellions or the Hawad rebellions in 2019 and 2020, where some of the tribal leaders that were most prominent were previously, if not associated with Saleh, they were part of the GPC, and they had continued to stay quiet to some extent in the previous years of the conflict. So what we have, particularly over the past, I'd say in 2020 and 2021, we have a move toward increased control, increased kind of repression by the Houthi movement over these local groups, and an increased co-option into state institutions. And I just included in the next couple of slides a few examples of how that worked.
Dr. Carboni, please conclude within 2 minutes. Thank you.
Yep. So this is a list, for instance, of the governors that were appointed by the Houthis over time since 2015. And if we see basically in 2015, 16, and still in 2017, most of them hail from the GPC, hail from the same regions they govern. And over time, they were increasingly replaced by loyalists of the Houthi movement, by Ansarullah loyalists, as I put in a legend. In the next slide, also very briefly, so this is some research I did for ACLED last year, and I updated with some new data. We see that infighting within Houthi ranks, so between members of the security forces of the Houthis, have peaked in 2020 and have increased, especially after they split forces with Saleh, to decrease significantly in 2021, which seems to reflect, that kind of effectiveness of the repression. In the next slide, just one more. We have also another indication of this, which is the number of violent events involving tribes, armed tribes in Houthi-controlled territories and their engagement with Houthi forces. And again, we see a substantial increase in between 2018, 19, and from I'd say second half of 2020, we see a decrease, and 2021 again. So there seems to be these, dynamics in motion of co-option and repression that's, have been effective in quelling or limiting the dissent. So I have the last slide, but it's just basically some reflections of on these. And my presentation is basically a call to reframe the meaning of what we mean by stability in Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is, also echoed in the latest report by the UN panel of experts. So it is stability, particularly the central level, but at the local level, there is, this wider instability that seems to be kind of subsiding in the last year or so. I'll leave it at that, and then we can leave for the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrea Carboni. Thank you very much for giving us this magnified and detailed look of the internal actors. And this is a very important part of trying to map and understand the dynamics of the conflict, and trying to understand and will help in trying to reach any sort of settlement. The papers presented in this session or during this panel have looked into different actors, different levels, and trying to understand the dynamics of the conflict. Despite how difficult the situation looks, and with the escalation and the crises that are occurring, obviously at different levels, there still remains a light at the end of the tunnel. And understanding this conflict better and in a more detailed manner helps us understand, or helps us trying to find this thread to these opportunities and to this hope, and trying to settle this conflict as soon as possible. Because of the humanitarian urgency more than anything else. Now, if you'll allow me, we will start the question and answer part of this panel. I remind you that you can still submit your questions through the Q&A function, as well as through comments on social media pages where the live stream is being broadcasted. If we could please take 3 questions and answer them, and then after that we can move on to another round of questions. Do we have any questions from the Zoom participants? The Zoom attendees, do you have any questions for our panelists? Okay, I will move on to asking some of the questions that we have received through the Q&A function, as well as through the social media pages or broadcasts. The first question is to Peter. How can there be work to build confidence between the various parties to the conflict? And how would you describe the role of the United States of America in the ongoing peace process? Please go ahead, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mona. And just a warning, I'm going to have to jump off the call in a few minutes. I do apologize, but I have an engagement after this. Very, very quickly, that really is the billion-dollar question. Is it possible to build trust? And the very simple answer is that the trust requires compromise. And compromise has been fundamentally hard to produce throughout the conflict. And many people will say that the Houthis are incapable of compromise, or that they only engage in negotiations in order to improve their situation, regroup, and push again. And of course, when you take this point to the Houthis, they will of course argue that the truth is that on the other side, this is the case. But I think the last 2 years, with efforts on the 4-point plan, the joint declaration, really showed the limits of anyone's willingness or ability to compromise in any way, shape or form, but the Houthis in particular, when they were on the front foot That's unquestionable. So what are people willing to give up in moments of strength? I think becomes sort of the fundamental challenge, and that goes back to this conversation about ripeness for peace, which we don't seem to have a lot of. The US position in the conflict has been 1 foot in, 1 foot out throughout, wanting to retain regional alliances, but not wanting to be seen as a party to the conflict. As of last year, the Biden administration tried to underline the point that it's not a party to the conflict, but is now finding itself sort of unable to sustain that position, and will probably be drawn back in some way. And that's going to make it very challenging for it to sort of present itself as a neutral, objective actor in the conflict. So really the same challenge of not being able to have its cake and eat it that it's had.
Thank you very much, Peter. Our next question is to Dr. Andrea Carboni, and the question is, how do you see popular acceptance of the Houthis outside of their areas of control? And I think the question here aims to see what is their popular acceptance in the areas under the control of the other side throughout Yemen if a political settlement is reached in the future. And we hope that is the case. Go ahead, Dr. Carboni. So the question is, what do you think, how do you see popular acceptance of the Houthis in the areas outside of the control if a settlement is reached?
It's a difficult question. So it's a difficult question because it implies that we can measure popular support, which is notoriously very difficult. What we can say is that, especially expansion into new areas since 2014, 2013, has always been met with resistance. We've seen in a number of occasions that even when there were rumors of pacts between, some, for instance, tribal sheikhs and the Houthis, that didn't result in peace or in a peaceful expansion. And what we have, this is for new areas, which is kind of, unlikely to happen, but not, impossible. What we have is that, continuously, there are a number of occasions in which, and again, Maysaa can also speak on that, but in which the imposition of customs or the imposition of kind of ideological party lines in both urban, rural areas is not always accepted, positively. And so that leads to violence and to violent outbreaks in many occasions. Again, the success to some extent of the repression means that these, episodes have decreased substantially over the past year or year and a half. But that doesn't mean that, this is going to last forever. And it also links to the situation in the national conflict to some extent, and how much revenues you can generate and how much revenues you can also extract from the population. And so that balance is kind of critical to determining the stability.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carboni, for your answer. The next question is to Ms. Maysaa Shuja Al-Deen. The question is, do you think that there is a possibility of implementing a federal system in Yemen after the war ends? And would it be possible to achieve an inclusive and consensus-based form at the national level in making a decision like this? Please go ahead, Maysaa. Maysaa, you seem to still be muted. Please go ahead. I think that until now, the idea of federalism, there is still consensus around the system. At the international level, there seems to not be any desire to divide the country and to divide Yemen. And it doesn't seem like the international community wants to have a number of failed states rather than one Yemeni state. And so the way out of this division and fragmentation and due to the fact that everyone is refusing to be subject again to central rule from Sana'a, as well as the regional and ideological basis of the Houthis, one that is made of elites from a certain area in Yemen, from a certain number of tribes and a certain sect, then this can only lead one that has a group that has a non-national references and principles. This means that Sana'a is no longer able to govern Yemen from a centralized position, and this will even weaken central government at the federal level in the future. But I would also like to mention a specific point, to reiterate a specific point here. One of the most prominent forms of governance in Yemen with fragmentation, there have been always comparisons between governance from Sana'a and Aden. This model will always show that Sana'a might be an easier option, but we need to take into account that Sana'a has not been as destroyed as other areas. The infrastructure has not been as destroyed as Aden has, and all state institutions were focused in Aden, whereas all of the areas that are outside, there was excessive centralization in all of the other areas, and so state institutions were very weak at the local level. They were very centralized in Sana'a, and this infrastructure helped them continue their governor, as well as the fact that they're an organized group and have cohesive leadership, whereas the conflict over power and authority in Aden has not been settled. There are important, however, local examples of governance, whether Marib or Shabwa and Hadramaut. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they have as resource-rich governorates, they have the financial resources, and these examples or these experiences have been good. The gap between the authorities and society was relatively small. First of all, because it is much easier to communicate with the local government, and also when you're at the local level, you cannot avoid dealing with society. You cannot, for example, provide electricity for yourself and for government buildings without giving electricity to the rest of the area. And so this kind of local accountability and the absence of accountability and the widespread corruption, this might be the best solution. The Houthis are governing through individual or personal networks of loyalty to Houthi leaders, those who are loyal to Abdul Malik al-Houthi, and he selects them based on previous relationships between them since the Saada Wars, and they have some form of immunity, and so there is no accountability. Okay, thank you. No, please, if you could finish the answer. So all I wanted to say was that this form of local governance during the war has shown that it is more successful than a centralized governance, and that it is better able to develop itself and deal with any problems that might come up. Thank you very much, Ms. Maysaa. We have a fourth question to Ibrahim. The question is, do you think that the lack of qualifications among the delegates to the NDC was a reason for its failure? And a follow-up question to this is, do you think there is another opportunity to operationalize the NDC and consider it to be a path to peace in Yemen? Go ahead, Mr. Ibrahim. The participants and the delegates to the NDC, they were selected in different methods. One of them was based on nominations from the political parties. Some of them were from different political groups. And usually it's difficult in this kind of way to have, with this level of diversity, to have fully qualified people be all of the delegates. And this, what we've seen, was representative of Yemeni society. And I think this is something that we cannot ignore, but obviously it has its implications, and there are things that can be done to improve it. The second aspect is that the NDC was in a different context than the context that we are in now, and looking at it as a sort of holy scripture is a grave mistake, because the situation has changed significantly. But there are items in the NDC on the form of the state, for example, that can be an important form of continuity for these vital discussions based on consensus, obviously, among Yemenis. There are some political aspects relating to a social contract, to the form of the state, and there are many efforts by the delegates to the NDC, and this is something that we cannot move out of the way and start from scratch. It is an important starting point for further rounds of discussions, and I think it can be that. It can play that role. Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Now, unfortunately, our time is up for this panel, for the session, and we have to adhere to the agenda as much as possible. If you'll allow me to conclude this session so that we can take a 5-minute break, and I apologize again for the short break, but we will take 5 minutes and come back to the next panel so that we can continue on our planned agenda for this conference. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the panelists and researchers. Thank you for your excellent presentations that have truly enriched our discussion today, and we will see you in 5 minutes.